and the nice thing about it is, that you can always instrument to deal with measurement error, but you can do other things to deal with measurement error, like measure stuff better, right? And I think that's a useful thing to think about. The second point I wanted to make is just something that often gets lost sight of. We often talk about elasticities, -0.1, -0.5, -0.05, whatever, and we say, oh, those are small. Well, I've said this before, not today, but that's a really tricky concept, right? Because what I don't know this expression. We have to sort of compare. There's this idiom in English where we say, comparing apples and oranges, right? You're sort of comparing two different things, and that's kind of what you're doing there, right? Because what we're always computing in these regressions, and I think including all the ones we did today, was the elasticity of an employment rate for some group relative to the legislated minimum wage. Okay, and there's two things that are funny about that. Right? One is the legislated minimum wage, and then people use that to say, oh, does a low elasticity must mean people are on average helped a lot, right? Well, first of all, the minimum wage goes up by less than the legislated minimum wage typically, either because of non-compliance or in the U.S., for example, where we raise the minimum wage every once in a while, because a lot of people's wages have crept up above the old minimum, and then maybe they get swept up to the new one, right? So the sort of implied wage effect is smaller than the legislated effect, right? And also, of course, that elasticity is only identified from affected workers who are always even if you're doing the employment regression for people with a high school education or less or whatever, a lot of them aren't affected by the minimum wage anyways. So what we care about is what is the elasticity for those who would actually potentially benefit from the minimum wage, and that's always a much bigger number. Well, it's always a bigger number, and it can be a much bigger number in absolute value, like a bigger negative number than these elasticities. I think that's actually very important to think about. Certainly those of you who like to talk to reporters and they say, oh, small effects, blah, 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 it's not so clear. And the only thing I'd say is this issue of compliance is clearly, like if there's going to be a continuing conversation, clearly something to sort out, because I'm not quite sure we all drew the same conclusions from your paper. But if we did, and if what Jane drew from it is the fact, in fact, when I was listening to you and listening to Jane, I thought you guys weren't exactly agreeing, but maybe I'm wrong. But it's obviously a key issue, right? So Carl's estimates sort of fit the standard literature, and you say you have the earnings regressions, results that are similar. The other paper, the firm level data, the elasticities are much bigger, and in fact, minimum wages aren't raising wages, then we're getting something else, but it must be spurious. So we're sorting that out quickly.
Great, thanks. John, do you want to have a couple?
I'm still trying to digest what I've heard about the China experience and Hong Kong experience. When I look at the Hong Kong experience, it reminds me just the history of the move towards legislation. It reminds me of what's gone on in other countries. Especially reminds me of the German situation with the Posted Workers Directive, providing a basis for minimum wage legislation in a number of activities before the national minimum wage comes in, 2015, at €8.50. So a large amount of commonality in terms of procedures, commissions, perhaps not enough is perhaps understood about how the drive towards legislation may be affected by the decline of the union movement. I think this is what we're seeing certainly seeing in Germany. The impetus towards legislation has not just come from a coalition government, but from the basic decline of collective bargaining. And so that may be a cost you have to bear it's not an issue here in Hong Kong, I admit, but it is in other countries. I think the subtlety of the situation in China, it was the thing that came across. The difficulty of measuring minimum wages, and then how do you measure compliance? How do you measure these things? It's much simpler in the United States. The only thing we have to worry about is what? Tip workers? There is no uncovered sector as such. Yes. So it reminded me of what's going on in lots of other countries' research, sometimes in less developed countries, they're called, where you have compliance issues loom very large, and where that requires to be considered in much more detail, compliance, how this is affecting results. And I'm a little confused. I'm still a little confused about what we've learned today. You mentioned it in terms earlier of affects earnings, big effect on earnings, and yet there seems to be a non-compliance problem. I find it difficult to, square that, to understand that. So I'm in a state of shock, in a sense, or information overload on the situation here. I'm also struck by the similarity of a lot of the research that's going on. The Board of Counties research struck me as very similar to what was being done in the United States, but perhaps much more subtle in a sense. I'm wondering if it was. I wonder how much of it was dictated by the American research and how much of it was sort of homegrown. I think a lot of it was, the subtlety was homegrown. I found that rather interesting. I'm still not sure what I've learned about it, and it's the sort of thing at the end I'd like to read all the papers, and so I hope we're going to get a chance to do that, and even comment further on them to the individual authors. And that's what I think, perhaps what could be our greatest contribution, perhaps, rather than a quick summary of what we've learned.
That's a lot less work.
Well, maybe we could divvy it up between us. But,
I'll do a quick summary.
I thought that was coming. But I think a little bit of information overload, to be honest, and I'd like a little bit more time to reflect on things.
Great.
But I'm really quite impressed by the quality of the research. I think that's what I'd like to get across, and both in terms of the descriptives and in terms of the analytics. And I think this was very refreshing. So I think I've learned a lot, but I have to think about that. But I've certainly come away with a feeling that there's still life in the subject. As we said earlier, the gift that gives on giving. I'm not sure to whom, but it's certainly a learning experience, and I'm going to read this stuff with interest and hopefully understand more.
Thanks. Nisha?
Okay. Yeah, I have the same feeling. Really learn a lot from the conference. So learn a lot. The peers of policy making process from other countries and from Hong Kong. I think now is very good timing for scholars to do some research on the minimum wage policy in China. That's why. That because we have very large demand from the government. I have been contacted by the minister or something like that. They always like to get advice from scholars, what kinds of policy we should make to make the balance between the unemployment and the growth of wages, something like that. So actually, the government is just because the policy have been introduced recently, the government have no good experience how to implement the policy, how to make adjustment in the minimum wage standards in the future. How can you do that? They really want to learn from the scholars. I think that is a good reason. Also, if you look at the research, in the past, you will find research is not enough. Also, high quality research is really needed. So that means, the different research uses different data, get a different result. Sometimes the government say, oh, you say really confuse me. What kinds of advice we should get from you? You say, that means they really need a high quality research on these issues. So that means what kinds of high quality research we want to know that. So I think first is the data set. That's important. Up to now, we still think some data set can be used for such research, but not so good enough. So we need to collect high quality, appropriate data. Second is, we really need some good methodology. So that means we like to do some cooperation with the international scholars or something like that. So in the October, we will organize the international conference on the minimum wage policy in the developing countries. Next year, when our project finishes, we want to organize another conference that is broader issues we cover. Also, even for the China, to learn something from the developing countries. So that means we would like to increase cooperation, international cooperation. Also, we like to increase communications with the government, something like that. Try to get our research more policy oriented. I think that's important. So that's it.
Great. Thank you. Great. And finally, Wing.
I think I'm the least qualified one to speak here because I've never written a single paper on minimum wage.
So you're objective.
But I'm a half knowledgeable consumer of this literature, so I think I can say a few words about it from the producer side point of view. I can say a few words from consumer side point of view. I also just happened to sit on this minimum wage commission, so there was a lot of opportunity for me to do this consultation with a lot of segments of society, and we received a lot of letters, and many of them are even handwritten letters. So I happen to sort of know what people care about. I guess one of the background is that perhaps because the minimum wage was introduced at a very good time and labor market was very tight, so there's not too much talk about employment effect, at least so far. You don't know what's going to happen if recession hits. So far, it has not been an agenda that has been on most people's mind. So what I find, so most people are concerned about minimum wage. There are several issues which seems to be neglected relatively speaking, neglected in the academic literature. One is what Silvia just mentioned about the knock-on effect. Everybody talks about it. There's this issue about internal relativity. You want to maintain the ranking difference. There's also a lot of talk about labor market reallocation because of especially at the point when it starts from nil to something. So the most common story was that the restaurants they lost all their workers because the workers want to become security guards. They pay the same, but the work is much easier. The only hold to this story is that the security guard companies are also complaining that their workers somehow disappear somewhere. But I think there is indeed a difference between introducing a minimum wage and kind of adjusting it, it seems like there was some evidence that it causes quite a bit of reallocation. I think the business sector exaggerated a little bit, but my personal prior was somewhat changed, especially by the picture that Silvia showed us about the relative wage increase of the different percentiles. There seems to be some pretty good, at least at the aggregate level, evidence which suggests that the minimum wage is affecting the bottom 10 percentile, but even the 20 percentile and 30 percentile seems to be fairly strong effect, which we don't see in other years. And also we didn't see the same thing when the minimum wage was adjusted between in year 2013, because at that point the adjustment was only $2. So it was a much smaller impact. And the fact that I can't see the same thing is actually kind of like a placebo test that seems to suggest that there's something there. So that's one thing I find quite interesting. And there are only a few papers in the academic literature that deals with it, and the evidence is mixed. But it seems like something, at least in this part of the world, it seems to be very important. The other thing that I find sort of overwhelming sentiment in many parts of the community was that people worry about inflation. So part of it is our fault that we didn't teach them the difference between inflation and price level, but I shouldn't be facetious. I think there's something real to it. There is relatively little research on the effect of minimum wage on price levels. And in this part of the world, it's felt quite keenly. I think for several reasons. One is that we have these people live in apartments, so everybody has to pay management fees. And these management companies, they are typically hiring security guards, janitors, garbage collection. These are all very low wage jobs. And there seems to be some evidence that the management fees are rising very quickly, and most people would attribute it to, at least partly, to minimum wage hikes. There's also, I think the evidence is a little bit less clear, but there's also a lot of complaints, at least from the community, about restaurant and food prices. This is, I think, a little bit less justified because during the last few years there was quite a bit of imported food inflation. But at the same time, I can't really completely rule it out. I kind of take a little bit issue with what David had just said about the minimum wage industries are largely kind of more affecting the rich, because it seems like many of the more
I was speculating that. More the case for Hong Kong than for the U.S. The U.S. is clearly the poor.
Because it seems like many of the, if you look at retail shops, the mom and pop shops are more influenced than the brand names, and those are primarily frequented by the poor. So I indeed saw a lot of concern about price level, which I think is first order importance, which has been largely ignored by the profession. So I think I'm just sort of sharing with the producers here that it would be useful to see more studies on those two fronts.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any final comments from anyone in the audience? Okay, so we're right at time. So let me. I did want to actually, for the emerging market minimum wage stuff, I did want to acknowledge Ching Xia, who did all the work on that, and so we're working together on that, and also you're an undergraduate student who helped us. And of course, I want to acknowledge all of the administrative support and volunteer support for today's event. For our staff at IEMS, Lois and Carla, I'm not sure if they're in the room. Are they not? They're not in the room, but let's give them a round of applause anyway. We should tell them about that. And then finally, dinner tonight is in an old fishing village near here, so it's very good seafood. And if you haven't told us yet but still want to come, just let me know. I think we might have 1 or 2 more spots left where we can squeeze in. So just come along. The bus should be down waiting for us now at the entrance. You can take a couple of minutes and go to the bathroom or get your stuff together, but just meet down at the entrance to the building. The bus will be there.